Before I took this trip here, I did something I had not yet done, although my friend Jimmy Fisher, you must know Jimmy Fisher, told me he had attended the 50th reunion, 68 reunion, and had gone to all the usual panels, you know, Goldberg panel and the Mosse panel and the Dow chemical panel. And I looked at them, and I just could not believe how extraordinary it was. Because the people, some of whom I had known but didn't recognize, had wonderful memories of things that jarred my own memory, and it was an extremely useful thing to do. I have a lot to, did a lot of thinking about this sort of Mosse-Goldberg relationship, and I learned some things I didn't know, I hadn't known, namely that George requested to be buried next to Harvey. One of the most extraordinary things. Because, you know, they were friendly rivals. It's not as if they had any trouble filling up the auditoriums. Right. Because that went without saying. They packed them in. A lot of these kids who came into the lectures weren't even signed up for the courses. You know, they just heard about this and they wanted to come and bathe in this sort of atmosphere. It was wonderful. And it was interactive. Those lectures were interactive. I mean, George accosted people in the audience, pointed them out, and don't you think so? And yes or no, and they would say something, and he'd go off on some tangent. Harvey didn't do that. Harvey had a more structured and formal lecture, which seemed to all of us as if he had committed it to memory. And there's some evidence that that was the case, that he was so obsessed with how he presented himself and that he did that. George was way more sort of loose cannon in his lectures, although he did stick to his themes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, we're gonna back up a little bit. See, those were the videos from the Madison reunion. Mm. Yeah, I'm glad. I was very happy that they put those up. The Mosse panel, I thought, came together well. They had a lot of different perspectives on Mosse. But we're going to start actually at the beginning, which is where were you born and what milieu were you born into?
Oh, okay, there you are. I was born in Concord, California, although my family lived at that time in Berkeley. My dad was a native Californian, my mom was a native Californian. I'm a fifth generation Californian, so I'm a native son of the Golden West. And we lived there until I was 4 years old, and then moved to the East Bay, and then finally to Walnut Creek, where I went to grammar school and high school, which is, you know, about 30 miles east of Oakland. I had, I think, a very good high school education, and that's all my mother or father had. My mother's parents had only 8th grade educations. So my dad did various things in his life. He was a salesman, he was a truck driver, he was decidedly kind of a lower middle class. We owned a house, and he did okay. There was always food on the table. But he had an up and down occupational life. And there's a certain sense in which this uncertainty and this, shall we say, errant occupational life that he had made me want to do something secure. Mm-hmm. And I was lucky to be born when I was born and came of age and college age when I did, because that was the time when higher education was expanding everywhere. Mm-hmm. California university system was expanding, the state college system in California was expanding, and as a consequence I was able to go to college and have a good college education.
Hmm. And where did you do your undergraduate work?
I did my undergraduate work, well, the thing that decided me where to go to college, my brother went to Berkeley because that was a logical place for him to go, because he wanted to be an engineer. I was very, very interested in history. I had some very, very good social science and history teachers when I was a high school student. But my main skill in those days was basketball. And this is one of the reasons that George and I hit it off, because I was a sportive man and he was a non-sportive man. He and I had some good conversations about sport. In any case, I had basketball scholarship offers from San Jose State and from USF. USF had just won the national championship about 8 years earlier. And I was a little creeped out when I visited the campus, though, because of all the guys in the long cassocks and robes. I thought, I don't know about this. so I went to San Jose instead. And I was very lucky, very, very lucky there, to have had access to some absolutely first-rate faculty who were scholars and teachers in small classes. It was kind of a golden age, I think, of higher education. Money was being pumped into the systems. It cost me precisely $75 a semester tuition to go to San Jose State. And as long as I was an athlete, which was true for the first 2 years, I was able to pay my room and board and all that, and could buy a car and pay my car insurance and go out on dates and that stuff, sort of thing, by having summer jobs, which I did every summer. It was just taken for granted I was going to do. My parents gave me nothing. Yeah. Dad didn't have any extra money to give me for my education, so that was just a lucky break. And then my last 2 years, I was a resident assistant in the dorms, and that paid my way, even though I did have to have summer jobs. So it was a lot easier to get and pay for higher education back in those days than it is now. Now,
go ahead.
Do you want to talk about graduate school? Or?
Well, I was curious more. You said that there were certain teachers that you had in high school and then in university. Were there classes or instructors that stood out and pushed you toward history?
Well,
or
here's the thing. If you come from the kind of background that I did, there was nobody who was going to say, "Oh, you're smart," or "You're this," or "You're that," or say to you, give you encouragement and say, "Well, you need to do more, do that." I read books and I was interested. I did very well in my high school classes. But there was some kind of an exam that I took, I think when I was a senior, maybe as a junior in high school. And it was some kind of a knowledge exam, like the SATs. And it was they were just trying to track the students to find out how they were doing. At the beginning of a class, my favorite teacher, his name was Robert Pape, who was my world civilization teacher. And he said, "Well, we just got the results back on that test. And guess what? Guess who was the best student?" And everybody kind of looked around like this. Who did the best on the test? Bob Nye. And those are the kinds of things that change everything. Mm-hmm. Not only was it interesting to me, but I was good at it. And I thought to myself, this is very encouraging. And at that point, I desperately wanted to be a high school teacher because I wanted to say what Bob Pape said to other students. Okay. And because I loved going to school and I loved classes and I loved reading the books. So that was my aim. When I got to college, I had some pretty serious scholars as teachers who were wonderful in the classroom and who, in a similar kind of way, sought me out because they knew I was, writing good essays and I was doing well in class. One of them was Charles Burdick, Burdick, who was a very, very famous military historian. And there was a time when I thought, "Oh, I want to do this." And in fact, I published something, even as an undergraduate, in military history that he had put me onto. But my favorite teacher was Irma Eichhorn, who taught European history. I was in love with her, like lots of undergraduate men are in love with their teachers of either gender. And I loved the way she blended literature and philosophy and intellectual life in the social and political history. I just thought it was wonderful, that sort of mesh. And decided that I really very much wanted to do European history. And so I thought I'd better get busy on the language front.
Yeah.
So I had 4 years of Latin in high school. And I cannot tell you, it's not taught anymore, I don't think in high schools, or hardly ever taught anymore in high schools, what a leg up that gave me on language learning for modern European languages. And I was able to achieve, by the time I got to graduate school, I was reading Italian, German, and was more or less able to get around orally in French. No question about trying to understand the structure of language from Latin, and then using that as a building block structurally for European languages. Extremely important. So by the time I was a senior in college and started applying for graduate school, I applied to European history graduate programs. And I got a one-year fellowship to come to UW. And in those days, shall I just keep talking about this?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. In those days, because I've been thinking about a lot of these things recently, there were 200 to 225 or 30 graduate students in the history department at the University of Wisconsin. And what you did was I learned later what you had to do, and people who were in the know did this. You had to get your application in early, because there was, if you didn't, you had to apply for a particular seminar to work with a particular professor in a certain field. And of course, I put Mosse's seminar down because I wanted to do intellectual history, cultural history. I wanted to do this big picture stuff, you know. Yeah. And if it filled up, then you went into then you put a second choice down. I put my second choice down as French history because I really liked French history and I could speak a little bit of French and could read it. And so I thought, well, maybe that'll be my backup. Well, as it turns out, Mosse's seminar was full. I got into Henry Bertram Hill's seminar. Henry Bertram Hill was not much of a scholar, but he did live next door to George on Glenway. They were neighbors.
Oh, man.
And I heard some George stories from Henry over the years. Anyway, so I ended up in French history. And because I'd had a little background in military history, I decided to do my master's thesis. This is the other thing you need to know about the program back then. And others will have been telling you the same thing. It was sink or swim. They didn't expect to graduate all 200 people who came in every year, or whatever it was, 75 or 50 or whatever it was. They didn't intend to graduate them. They expected attrition, and they expected a lot of these people would simply disappear. Either they would not be able to finish their master's degree on time, which was 1 year. You had precisely 1 year to write a 75-page master's thesis and take all your other courses. And if you were a TA, although I think most first-year people didn't do TA. You had to wait till your second year to do TA. So there was a lot of pressure. I mean, a lot of pressure. And then halfway through your second year, you took your preliminary exams. That weeded out a whole bunch more. So the pressure was on. And once you got on campus and tried to figure out what your next move should be, you realized that you're going to spend 12 to 14 hours a day with your face buried in a book, that there was no other way to negotiate the system, that having an alliance, have a protector or a mentor or something wasn't going to help you. You had to jump these hurdles. Well, make a long story short, I jumped the hurdles, wrote a master's thesis on 18th century, late 18th, early 20th, early 19th century French military history. Luckily enough, there were the books I needed were in the library, the UW library, because, you know, what would I have done otherwise? Yeah. Drive down to the University of Illinois, there aren't many alternatives.
Right.
And it was acceptable. I'm not sure how good it was, but it was acceptable. But I got to know lots of George's students at that point. And by that time, I was in his class, I had taken all his classes, all the classes he offered that first year. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to do intellectual history in the worst way. And I thought, well, I can do it in French history. So that was the deal. I worked with Henry Hill, and I would do it in French history. And once I finished the military thing, and got that out of the way because it was something I could do fast, I'd find a topic. Well, I found the topic, as I said in my introduction to the lecture. found the topic in George's class. It was Gustave Le Bon, who was the original and most popular theorist of crowd psychology. That's what do people do in collectivities, and how do they behave, and how our emotion, what's the relationship between emotion and reason, and so on. George loved Le Bon because he thought that Le Bon had it right about the way people were in mass politics, which is only part of the story, as it turns out. And I read the book that George had in his class, and Mosse's The Crowd. It's sort of big popular book, went through 50 editions or something like that from the time it was published in 1895. And I read the introduction by no less a person than Robert K. Merton, America's greatest sociologist from that period. And I thought, this is all wrong. He's got this all wrong. And so I went in and talked to George. And it was, I think, probably the first substantive discussion I had with him. And I said, George, Merton is wrong about this, that, and the other thing. And I gave him this little list. And he said, well, why don't you do it correctly? And I had been inclining in that direction, but I think I needed just a little bit of a push. So from that moment on, I knew what my dissertation topic was going to be. And George and I did not really stay in touch very much about that until somewhat later, after I had come back from France and we'd done my basic research. Another story in connection with this, however, which is, I think, interesting and useful, it tells you something. George encouraged me. The other person I admired the most, of course, was Harvey Goldberg. And I knew Harvey a little as well. And Harvey he had left his office, was going to class, and I walked with him between wherever he was going to lecture after that. And I said, Harvey, I want to try out on you my idea for a dissertation topic. And he said, sure. And I said, well, I read this book, The Crowd, in one of George's classes, and there's been nothing on him, no scholarship at all. And I very much want to do a dissertation on this guy. He's this guy who was, Mussolini read him, and Hitler read him, and all these right-wing guys were inspired by him, and all the anti-democratic thinkers of the 19th century were inspired by him. And Harvey said, why would you want to study someone who has ended up in the dustbin of history? I was shocked. And I realized at that moment that Harvey's ideological commitments ran so deep that he could not even imagine a real historian who also had to have an activist component in his or her nature could actually want to study that. And that was the last time I ever talked to Harvey Goldberg. I had nothing more to say to him after that, really. After I came back from France, George and I had more conversations about it. He was very excited about what I had found. I got some personal papers. I had read all his work and found lots of interesting biographical materials from him, and then had studied this sort of social science context. Now, the other part of the story is a love story. I had met Mary Jo, my wife, in 1964 because she lived in the apartment building that I lived in. And she was an undergraduate at that point still. She had transferred to UW from Vanderbilt, where she was born and raised in Nashville. And she was a chemistry major. But she took a history of science course her senior year. She's 2 years younger than me at that point. And she fell in love with history of science. And she said, I don't want to go into a chemistry lab. I want to be a scholar. And so it was about that time, I think after my first year of graduate school, that she entered the program, the history of science program, was interested in getting into the history of science program. And in those days, you had to take a minor field as a graduate student. and take 12 credits, I think it was, and take a seminar. And so I said, I'm going to be a history of science minor field. And because the LeBone thing, history of the social sciences, was under the general rubric of the history of science, I decided that I was going to take classes with Mary Jo. So I would be able to do two things at once. I'd be able to do my minor field and be with Mary Jo. And as it turns out, very fortunately, there was a new faculty member in the history of science department whose name was Victor Hiltz. And Victor Hiltz had studied the history of genetics and the history of the application of early genetic knowledge to the social sciences, Pearson and Galton and those people. And I learned a lot from his classes, and he encouraged me as well. And that was very useful information, structural information, trying to think about the social sciences as an historical topic that set me on my way. When I went to France, I had all this material and ideas in which to fit, slots in which to fit all this stuff. And then, there's another story. Wrote my dissertation. My wife and I were both working on our dissertations at the same time. I was a little ahead of her because she was a little bit behind me in the graduate school program. And we lived at that time up on Gilman Street in an apartment that we couldn't afford now. As we were just talking about earlier.
Yeah.
And I finished my dissertation, and I think there was a deadline of some kind, and I had to give it to them for 3 weeks or something like that in advance. So it was 400 pages or something big. I gave copies to George and copies to my major professor, Henry Hill, and to, I can't remember who the other people on the committee were, Bob Cale maybe? Oh, Ted Hammerl was on the committee. And then the oral came, and George looked around like this and said, "Does anyone mind if I start?" And then he just engaged in this wonderfully enlightening and stimulating discourse. And we had a nice discussion. My major professor did not ask one question.
Really?
And why do you suppose that was? Because he hadn't read it. So now, you have to understand where we were back in the late 60s. He probably had 25 people in his seminar. There was at least 25 people in the seminar when I took it from him. He had master's theses and things to read. And he thought to himself, this isn't George's area anyway. Let him handle it. For all I know, they actually discussed that. But George had read it very carefully and had lots of wonderful suggestions. And it was, I felt very good about it after it was all over. It's quite wonderful.
Yeah.
And it's, I think by that point, by that point I had a job. So I was one of the very lucky ones who actually ended up getting a job that year, because all the people who were finishing up their dissertations that year, 1969, weren't getting any jobs. It was just full up everywhere. I was lucky.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about your cohort and who else made it through, and whether did you have reading groups, or what was the graduate student life
Well,
like?
I'll tell you, here's the problem with the so-called graduate culture. I've already touched on some of this. It was sink or swim. Once you got past the first two big hurdles, then you could actually invest in learning something about somebody else, because they weren't going to be casualties later on down the line. And there was a lot of that, a lot of grief. There was a lot of tension. There was a lot of, should I cultivate a relationship with this person? You know, it's an investment of some kind, emotional investment, a time investment. There were no reading groups. What there was political activism. And a really strong sense of agreement about the atrocities of the Dow experience, the war in Vietnam, Harvey's classes were a very important meeting place for that kind of thing. And yet George had his little coffees out on the terrace, and students who wanted to go talk to him. And he was anti-war. He had the same positions on the war as Harvey and the rest of us. But I didn't get to know his students all that well until actually later, when we used to meet at the American Historical Association meetings. Cy Drescher and all those people, Andy Rabenbach. Got to know all those guys very, very well. I know one little quick story about Harvey George stuff. I took one of George's, I think my second year in graduate school, I took a course, one of George's courses. I can't remember which one it was. His TA was Joan Scott. Well, Joan was a flaming Marxist in those days. A loyal Harvey student.
Yeah.
And she was fiery and she was articulate. And she would spend a lot of each class highlighting the dubious aspects of, or encouraging us to also find criticisms of some of the things that George would say in class, or something from one of his books. The point about all that is it was enormously fruitful, because there were two sides to many of these issues. And she adhered very strongly to one side. She has become the most splendid and amazing historian. But in those days, she was more of an ideologue than not, although brilliant. And it was so useful to think about this dialogue between George and Harvey, which took place, and it was all about politics, it was about activism, it was about the origins of class consciousness, it was about where ideas came from, how the culture worked. And all we did was talk about those things in our different discussion groups or friendships or going and having a beer or whatever it happened to be. Those were the ways in which our arguments were organized. And it was, and I've said this to other people for years and years, we read all the key texts in Harvey's and George's courses. There were other courses. The modern British historian, I'll see if I can remember his name later, wonderful stuff also with theory in it, and lots of good social history. And we learned a lot about theory and about what was happening really almost contemporaneously in the theoretical world, because that's what they were interested in. And George was especially good about this. He was especially good. The young Marx, for instance, I mean, it was just illuminating, the neo-Hegelians and all that stuff. We didn't study classic Hegel's texts, but we learned about him through the way in which his 20th century acolytes were applying it to radical politics and historical interpretation. And that was what was really exciting and moving about it all. And you felt like you were on a cutting edge of some kind, that this knowledge was going to be useful to you in whatever you did, whether you became an activist or just a voting Democrat or a teacher or a scholar, that this was going to be useful to you. This was not just something you learned so you could pass the graduate exam. This was useful knowledge. And everything we were taught, we were encouraged, everything that we, in our entire environment, had to do with making use of what you learned so that you could become more insightful about the nature of historical change and have some influence on it. Mm-hmm. Everybody I knew thought the same thing. And we could not escape it. There was no hermeticism. There was no hermetic knowledge that was not somehow related to other things. If you took a literature course, and my friend Jimmy Fisher used to take Germaine Bray's course, it was all about activism. It was all about the politics. It was all about, what counted to make the world change. And it marked us all. every one of us has been marked by it, because if you do other interviews of other people from that cohort and that generation, you're going to hear them say the same thing over and over and over again. It's simply inescapable. It was a time unlike any other. I'm sure it persisted on into the 70s for a while longer. It's not there anymore. There is activism. There are strong activist communities on college campuses nowadays, and in graduate schools of renown. But it's what we call social justice activism, which is not the same as world historical activism, which was what we were thinking about all the time.
That's economies of scale.
Yep.
Were you involved, or?
Yes, I was.
To what extent?
Well, not to the extent. Here's the thing. Now, this is just me.
Yeah.
When I listen to Bernie Sanders talk now, what do I see? I see some of the blowhards who were our leaders back in the late 60s. Bernie happens to be stuck in that narrative, and he can't get out of it. He can't grow. He can't see any other side. That's the way those guys were. And, there was always debate. I mean, everybody debated. But there was some point at which a group of guys and women would scream down objections to what they planned to do. I didn't like that. I never liked it. George didn't like it. George hated it and constantly preached against it. He said, build consensus, but don't do it by force and by coercion or by moral blackmail or any of that business. It was just after the Dow. I was a teaching assistant, teaching for John O'Connor, who was an early modernist. I was teaching early modern history, but that was good for me too. Yeah. And after the Dow events, the Graduate Student Union, which had only formed a month or two before that or something, decided to have a strike. We were going to not teach our classes, and we were going to bring our students out. Oh, well, that was the discussion. We bring our students out for a mass rally. And a bunch of us said, no, let's have a teach-in. Let's talk about politics. Let's talk about the war in Vietnam. Let's talk about the use of the National Guard to suppress demonstrations at the Social Science Building. Let's talk about that. And the activists wanted to go out and demonstrate and confront the National Guard, who were all over campus by that time, occupying the campus essentially. And we said, no, let's have a teach-in. And most of us did. I think my memory is that most of us had the teach-in. The other guys went out to do their confrontational stuff. And it was enormously useful, enormously useful. It was a consciousness-raising moment for the students, I think, but also for the TAs who were doing this. I think a lot of the faculty, of course, didn't teach, or did teach-ins too. I know the left-wing faculty did. I know George did. And the point was that this was good for the students, but it was also good for us. And it was useful knowledge because when Kent State happened, and I was teaching at the University of Oklahoma, it was my idea and lots of other people who had gone through events in the 60s to have teach-ins after Kent State as well, which we did, and it was extremely useful. Those were the times we lived in. And I did some marches back then, and utterly sympathetic to the anti-war movement. And just as a sort of side issue, and this is kind of important, because all of us in graduate school then had to face what to do about the draft. Many of us came from districts, as I did, recruiting districts, which had a shortage of men. And they could annul your student deferment and request for you to come for a medical exam, which would in my case have been in Milwaukee. And this was happening to a lot of the people in my cohort. And of course it helped make us more radical against the war. It certainly spurred us on. But it also made us think about strategies about what to do. And my strategy, I had two strategies. The first strategy was to go into traction, literally, go into traction, attach weights to my feet on pulleys, and then to lie flat on a rented car to go to Milwaukee and be measured as over 6'6", which was at that time the cutoff. And I tried that a few times, and I could be 6'7¼ when in traction for 24 hours beforehand. That was option number one. Option number two was to go to Canada. I was not going to go to the war. Mary Jo and I had long discussions about it. She said that she'd go to Canada too. And we had all these talks. It was very important. People had to make that decision. You had to. I was getting ready to finish my dissertation and, go out on the job market. But that was the choice we had. We had no other choice. And, they didn't have the lottery system until, 70, 71, something like that. So that was after my time. So I was an activist in that sense, not an activist who was going to go underground and fight the SDS or something like that, but I was going to leave. Anyway, that's my activism, and of course, my whole political worldview has never really changed from those years, as it turns out.
Yeah. Well, formative times to forge it. So.
Yeah, very much so.
I have a question about basketball, actually.
Sure.
And so you said you played as an undergrad
I did.
For the first 2 years. And
I did.
Did you continue to play when you came to Madison? Or?
All right, this is...
Because you talked about you and George, a man of sport and a man of not sport.
George, he thought, he was a great tease. George was the greatest teaser ever. He'd find out something about you, and then he'd exaggerate making wild claims about things that you did, or accuse you of saying something, bragging about yourself or something. It was impossible. But he would laugh at his own jokes, but he'd make everybody else laugh. Because I was going to say earlier that I have two faces for George. One is this laughing face. The other one is, I'm talking about Nazism here, face.
Yeah.
And they couldn't be more different. And yet, he could go from one to the other pretty fast. Anyway, the basketball. I'm not going to bore you with a bunch of sports stuff, but I will say this, that I played freshman basketball. You couldn't play varsity ball until your second year in those days. And, I was on a basketball scholarship. But in those days, what did that mean? I mean, after all, that meant it was a grant and aid. So they paid for my tuition, $75 a semester, and room and board, which couldn't have been more than $75 a month,
Sure.
Chicken feed.
Yeah.
And so it occurred to me after a while that I didn't have to do this. Well, I was a very successful player in my freshman year, and then I played in my sophomore year as a varsity player, and I started 4 or 5 games, so I was doing okay, I was making my contributions. And then something really terrible happened, which I found so offensive that it was one of the things that caused me to quit playing. One was racial tension on the basketball team. Not between me and the two black players on the varsity team. But 2 or 3 of the white players were engaging in racial tension with the two of the black players. One of the black players was Harry Edwards. You ever heard of Harry Edwards? Harry Edwards is a very famous sociologist of sport, ended up teaching at Berkeley, and was an activist when he was a graduate student at Cornell, led the sit-ins at the chancellor's office. Harry knew all the Black Panthers, and when he was in Berkeley, he was the head of he's a sports activist. Look him up, you'll be quite amazed at the things that he has managed to do Harry and I were the only players when they'd get on the team bus to go down to play Santa Clara or go up to play USF. That was our league in some Central California area. Who had books with us on the bus. We were the only ones that ended up getting PhDs. We were the only ones who got involved in active politics during our graduate school years, as far as I know, anyway. The coach, his name was Stu Inman, kind of let this happen, this racial tension. And there were some fist fights and some other stuff that went on. And it was deeply unsettling.
Yeah.
And then it turns out Stu Inman had falsified some academic records so he'd get a couple of players, transferred players from USC. And this was found out, and we forfeited. We had had a very good season my sophomore year. We had won most of our games. And then came the news that that the coach had falsified records, and we had to forfeit all our games. These are games that we had worked hard to win. We had kind of an identity and a sort of pride at having done so. And he just took them away from us. And I didn't decide it at that moment, but I thought, this is the end of my playing career. One way or the other, I'm not going to do this anymore. I didn't trust him. I didn't like the racial tensions on the team, and I thought I held him partially responsible for it. And so that spring, I looked for a resident assistant job, and they hired me. And so that was my segue. Yeah. Then when I came to Madison, I was, I didn't have the sort of exercise regimen I have now as an old guy. It was too busy.
Sure.
I tried to explain already that I had all these books to read, library time to spend. So, I didn't get much exercise in, but by the time I was past the hurdles, I joined the intramural. Actually, it was not the intramural, it was the City League. And I played basketball with Badger Sports, which used to be on State Street but no longer exists. Or maybe it does exist, it just has moved its venue somewhere. It's a sporting goods store. And Badger Sports had always sponsored a team in those days. And I had the greatest time. It was really fun because I was still enough in shape that I could run up and down the floor and play. And we had some great, I had some great teammates. And we won the championship the year I played. It was great fun. And I think George teased me about that as well.
Yeah.
Your greatest accomplishment today, something like that.
That's awesome.
Jimmy Fisher has a story. He claims, of course, he lived with George, he and his wife Clarice. He has a story about George that George wanted to have it both ways. He wanted to be able to argue that he was outside looking in on male bonding and masculinity in sports, and so he had this detached, objective view. But he couldn't resist saying that he also played a few sports when he was a young guy.
Yeah.
Jimmy Fisher actually believes it. I don't really believe it because George he knew nothing about sport. He couldn't have told you the rules of baseball if his life depended on it, or any other sport for that matter. He used to make fun of what's the coach's name? The coach who lost every game. I think it was my second or third year in graduate school. He lost. Wisconsin football team lost every game they played. They were 0-13 or 12 or something like that. And George used to make fun of him.
That's awesome.
God.
I know Mosse told a story about playing soccer growing up and being removed from the team after he kicked it into his own goal.
I think I remember that story. It's possible. Some of those things are possible. I know that in his memoir he talks about how he didn't like team sports and he wanted to do things individually on his own. Well, that's because he just didn't like being around this masculine atmosphere. He didn't want to be a part of it. He didn't mind observing it and trying to understand how it functioned. He just didn't want to be a part of it because he was the little guy. Or should I say, the little Jewish guy. Even worse. So, anyway.
It's true. Then I also, but related to what you'd already talked about, there's this interesting point that you brought up about this intersection of activism, reading theory, and the European seminars. And one thing that I've noticed, like with the everyone who's finished their PhD at UW in European history around your time, is that there's the books endure in ways that works that get too involved in theory can't. And so there's an interesting group of scholarship that I was reading your book again this week, but also Joan's work and Steve's work, Andy's with the human motor. That it is in dialogue with theory, but it's not subsumed.
That's right.
Into theory. And
that's exactly right.
I wondered if you might just, how did this come about? Because I think it's pretty unique to UW during this decade.
Well, I think a lot of it had to do with Marx's early writings and with the neo-Hegelians that we all read during that period of time, many of whom were more or less contemporaries, post-World War II, for recent stuff. And it was all about praxis. The whole point was, yes, you need theory. Yes, you need theory because you need to understand how history works, how class divides form, how economic structures create class formations, and then how that has political ramifications. But then you need to understand when time is ripe for change. You need to understand, studying the past, given what was going on in a given time, whether the time was ripe for change or whether your analysis can explain why change did not occur. So in other words, this understanding of the relationship between theory, analysis, and practice, mass movements, political movements of various kinds. Now, George was right on the cusp of all that, all the time. He never could ever think about theory or an aesthetic theory or architecture or statuary or male movements of any kind without thinking about its immediate political implications or possibilities. He taught us that, so did Harvey. See, that's the other thing. Harvey also wanted to know, why the hell hasn't that revolution happened yet? Yeah. Or when it happened, why did it happen in Russia, of all places? Yeah. So Harvey was always trying to figure that out. George could care less about the Russia business, but it's pretty clear that we were all, because of our experience and because of what we had been going through ourselves, what we were reading, it was indispensable. When you were talking about, for instance, my first book on Gustave Le Bon and crowd psychology and mass politics, and it was the beginning of democratic politics in the Third Republic, and so this is exactly where my frame of mind was. As it turns out, who could mobilize the masses better, the left or the right? George taught me something about that. He said that the right knows how to use symbols and images that draw on national experience and people who are uneducated and haven't thought through what their personal interests are and how they stand to profit from this or that political alternative will go with that set of images. And so this is what George was teaching us. That's what I learned from learning about late 19th century French history, that it was the right, and of course Le Bon was advising people on the right to use these symbols. And during World War I, he did the same sort of thing. So this was the first lesson that I had. And the second lesson from George that I learned that had to do with activism. And this is, I'm not being critical of George, I'm just saying he didn't really care about science. He knew science was important. And I'm sure that when I read the annotations in my book, he will have noticed times when whatever he's reading, there's generalizations from science. I know that I did the Foucault-Mosse annotation, and he was aware of that there. He knows how to use generalizations about what science was teaching, but he also understood history of science well enough to know that science didn't always get it right, that there were scientific theories out there that survived for a very long period of time, like degeneration theory or something like that, that had absolutely no foundation in fact whatsoever. People believed it, though, you see. And so George very early on understood that scientific ideas, even the wrong scientific ideas, used the prestige of science, the scientific reputation and knowledge for practical purposes. And politicians who were able to do so used those characteristics to make hay. And George understood that. He understood that from the very beginning, because George was, if nothing else, the most extraordinary pragmatist with respect to how to use knowledge. He used knowledge the way people historically used it, for one purpose or the other. And he understood what those purposes were, even if he didn't understand the logic or the science or anything behind it. He understood how it worked. He was brilliant and intuitive about that. And he, of course, he would tease students in class, the left-wing students in class who were going to go out and do this and do that. He would tease them about, this Meg.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. He would tease them about what they thought they knew.
Yeah.
And try to poke holes in it, but not so much epistemologically, but rather indicating that they're just swallowing down something they know nothing about.
Well, yes, another great one that says, my students love to talk about Marxism. That is until I assign Karl Marx.
That would certainly follow. I mean, I learned as much about Marxism in Mosse's courses as I did from Goldberg, where it was sort of prepackaged and made to serve a certain purpose.
Yeah.
So there you are.
Let's chronologically go to as far as we've gotten, which is you've defended your dissertation,
Yep.
and you've gotten your first job.
Yep.
And I wondered if you just might talk about the trajectory of your career.
Okay. Sure.
You mentioned that you stayed in touch with Mosse and saw him after leaving Madison,
Yep.
and maybe we could talk about
Sure.
how your scholarship has developed. And
Sure.
I mean, it's a lot. I mean, I know
Yeah,
it's a lot.
I'll try to condense it. But I can't tell the story of my scholarly career without talking about Mary Jo, who, as it turns out, became relatively early on a very distinguished historian of science and president of her society, and has won at least 3 big scholarly awards, including the main one that her organization gives, the Sarton Medal. I got the job at Oklahoma and set about the business of doing what everybody should do, try to publish their first book as soon as possible. In those days, there were no tenure requirements. Tenure requirements were a development of the late 70s. Nobody understands that anymore. It didn't. They did. What happened is people would judge you on the basis of whether or not you were a good colleague, were effective in the classroom, where there were no complaints about drinking or molesting women, and then you got tenure. I'll never forget. It was the end of my 3rd year at Oklahoma, and I got a note in my mailbox. I had published, I think, at that point, a couple of 3 articles, maybe. My book didn't come out till 75, and this was 73. It said, "Congratulations, you've been given tenure at the University of Oklahoma." That's what it was like. Okay. At least at non-mainstream universities. That's the way it was. What it was like. Just don't raise a fuss, don't rock the boat. You'll get tenure. But I think Mary Jo and I always thought that we really wanted to make a mark as scholars. And so we published, and we tried to get grants and fellowships, and she eventually got a position in the History of Science department after the most amazing sort of resistance on the part of her old guard colleagues there, who saw it as nepotism, that she should, and she was a woman after all, and doing history of science? Come on, this is not a woman's field. The resistance she got was simply extraordinary. Yeah. Anyway, it doesn't matter. She quickly showed what she was made of and published her dissertation very quickly, started on another project, published that quickly, and so on. And we both did that. So we were at Oklahoma for 25 years. And I'll try to make this a little bit shorter. And during that period of time, I went to most American Historical Association meetings. George went to almost all of them for one reason or another, but not least because all his former students would come and people who were part of his coterie. And we would go, and there would always be there would be a reception for Mosse, a Mosse reception for former students. And it would be usually held in tandem with the Wisconsin graduate student thing. Or maybe Mosse students were the only ones who came. I don't remember. But we'd all see one another. And I've stayed in touch with a lot of these guys over the years. And everyone would be gathered around George, and he'd be laughing and telling stories and joking. He was so proud of everybody. It was clear. He was so proud of them. And I always was very grateful for the fact that George, even though I wasn't a student, that George stayed in touch with me, that we met on at least 2 occasions in London for dinner. My wife, I think his sister and himself on one occasion. And then once in Paris, after he'd been on some kind of a research trip to Germany and met me in Paris, told us all about his new project, had to do with toys and toy soldiers and all that stuff. He was so excited. And this is the thing that was so extraordinary about him, is that when he was on something new, something he was learning about, he was like a young boy. His eyes would light up, he would tell stories. And of course he had a habit late in life of spitting a little bit when he talked. So he would cover you when he got excited. He always picked up the tab. We went out to dinner. It was very sweet. And then I sent him my books as they came out. And I don't know if he promised. I don't know if there's any other books are in his collection.
They probably are. It's just
Yeah,
the collection's in disorder.
Yeah. But anyway, I'm delighted to be able to look through these annotations to see what he has to say. Of course, the thing which you know, and maybe not everybody else knows, is that I think I got interested in something that's called history of sexuality before George did, although George was interested in the subject, as I said in my interview from the early 60s. He was interested in sexuality, but the idea that sexuality had some kind of a history is not something that he really articulated strongly until the 1990s. And I understood it had a history, I think, maybe slightly earlier than George, and then we kind of tracked each other in the work that we did on masculinity and sexuality throughout the 90s and late 80s and 90s. I guess I started publishing on sexuality probably in 1883, 84, something like that. And of course he was also, when National Sexuality came out in 1985, so he was also well into it by that point. And I sent him my off-prints, and he must have the off-prints stored away somewhere. And I think he learned something from me, because I was doing more sort of nitty-gritty research, looking at texts, see what the psychiatrist said and see what the doctor said. And I think George always wanted to look at the big picture more than I did. And I think he profited from some of the things that I was doing over the years. But, of course, I was just wonderfully encouraged by the fact that he was moving into this field. He was, you think about the fields that George has gone through in the course of his scholarly career, from early modern church history in theology to where he ended up. It's really quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
And he was just like a meteor shooting across the sky. I mean, everybody, all of his former students were just amazed at how he kept up, how he found the energy, how he continued to be interested in new projects, and was willing to learn. Definitely.
I think there's no question that he learned from you. I mean, he mentions your work in the lecture for the course.
Yes,
example.
That's right.
And you'll see in the annotations that it's
Yeah.
very. There's a
Yeah.
deep dialogue there.
Yeah.
And then I wondered, related to the time period that we're on, if you might talk about the classes that you developed and
Sure.
the courses that you've taught in your career?
Sure. Because I was doing the history of the social sciences and history of medicine and biology by the time the 80s came out, I became an adjunct member of the history science department at Oklahoma. And then when we moved to Oregon State in 1994, I became a full-fledged member of the graduate faculty in the history of science department group there. It was actually part of the history department. So I spent as much time doing history of science stuff as I did, regular intellectual history stuff. And I did teach some history of science courses, history of biology, history of medicine courses over the years. But my bread and butter, the courses I liked the most, I taught French history too and that sort of thing, was the intellectual history survey. And I taught intellectual history survey from 1700 to the present, 18th century, 19th century, 20th century. I love those courses. I think probably I felt I was channeling George, at least when I got to the 20th century courses. I used the writings of the young Marx. I used books that students couldn't even begin to read today. Yeah. Yeah. And here's the other thing. I taught semesters when I was at Oklahoma, and then quarters when we got to OSU, and I had to change my whole schedule, my whole syllabus. I used 12 paperback volumes when I was teaching at the University of Oklahoma in each intellectual history course. Every course was full. The students read the books, and they wrote well enough to be able to understand what was going on and to answer exam questions. Mm-hmm. It was simply astonishing. And when I tell colleagues, my younger colleagues today about this, they just shake their heads like this. No, we can't do that. The students will protest if you use more than 3 or 4 books. Mm-hmm. And if a book's too difficult, the student will raise their hand and say, I can't understand this. This is all gobbledygook. Anyway, that's what I hear. I haven't been teaching. The last course I taught was, I think, about 5 or 6 years ago. But anyway, that's my, those are the courses that I love the most, and those were my bread and butter courses. And then when I started studying sexuality, I started a course on the history of sexuality. The first time I taught it was at Harvard, and we were invited. Mary Jo remembers dates better than I do. I think it was late 80s, mid 80s, something like that. And I taught a history of sexuality course. Nobody had ever taught it there before. And there was some doubt about whether or not this was really history of science. But I think I proved it, that it was. And then I worked up a course at Oklahoma and started teaching it. And that became my favorite course because students were engaged in a way that they never were in any other course I ever taught, because it was somehow personal. Because even though we all have histories, they're short for students, but they all knew about their sexualities. And they were all thinking about how their experience squared with historical experience in the past. It was so easy. Teaching those classes was like, going downhill. It was all the students wanted to have something to say. There was lots of discussion. They were wonderful classes. And I used lots of books in those classes too. And they read them. Now in the old days, when I started teaching it in the 1980s, all the students except 2 or 3 were men. All straight men. Frat boys sometimes, Oh yeah, sex. Oh yeah, I can handle it. Women didn't say anything. They kept their mouths shut. The sources that we were reading were not, shall we say, strictly heteronormative, off-the-shelf stuff. It was challenging. We're talking about homosexuality, and we're talking about oppression of women, and we're talking about all this stuff. And over time, what has happened to my history of sexuality courses is that the men are the minority, sometimes a great minority. Sometimes I only had one male student in a sort of seminar student of 15 or 18 students. It became clear that the history of sexuality is a history of the oppression of women by men, of sexual minorities by heterosexual men, and of the most awful kinds of characterizations and character assassinations and violence and the rest of it. It took a while for that to get established in the history of sexuality literature, but once it did, men were less comfortable in the course than they had been. And I actually worry about the future of the discipline and of the field now, given that the majority of students that take them are transgender kids, gay and lesbian students, and women, feminists. And men, even nowadays, feel creeped out about that, I think. And so I'm really wondering how to get to teach that subject in a way that reintegrates men who are not knowledgeable about this stuff, or frightened of it or uncertain about it. I taught intellectual history up to the very end. I enjoyed it enormously. I'll just be quick about this. To this day, and I learned this from George, some of Mary Jo's and my very best friends are our former students. Undergraduate students, in almost all cases. Some graduate students are still good friends, but undergraduate students, very good friends. We always made an effort to try to get to know our smartest students and the ones who seemed most keen on making a profession out of learning. And all I can say is it's a blessing. And I think George must have felt that way about, and when the times when he got together with his former students. He didn't have any children of his own, so they were his children. And I have a child, but I still feel the same way about all these kids. Yeah. Not kids anymore. Some of them are retired. But it's been the greatest life, and it's because I think your intellectual peers are also your social peers, and you have so much in common and you exchange so much. And there are also, that starts off as a mentor relationship with it's just a relationship of kindness and consideration and mutual respect. And those things have all endured in my personal relationships with my former students and with some of my former professors, and certainly like with George until the end of his life. And it was, shall we say, UW and the years 64 to 69 marked me enormously. A little moved here. I found the love of my life. I found to do what I wanted to do. I found my best friends. Oh, Jimmy Fisher, by the way, was one of my graduate students, one of the students, an undergraduate student in one of my TA classes. Really? And he said to me one day, after class, he said, "How does a guy like me get to know a guy like you?" I said, "Buy me a beer, asshole."
That's great.
And the rest is history. And he's been my oldest and closest friend for over 50 years.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Did you know that Mosse was gay when you were a student here?
Oh, you should ask me that. Can you want me to add that in?
Yeah, is that yeah?
Yeah, sure.
Time, yeah.
I do.
It's
the issue of gay, of course, the reunion videos all sort of had integrated that knowledge. Yeah. But the question did come up in some of the references. In those days there were such things as lifelong bachelors. Mm-hmm. And everybody just took them to be men who were single-minded or didn't get along with women very well. The idea of thinking about them as potentially gay just didn't come up. Mm-hmm. This was the mid-60s. I had no idea, in short. Mm-hmm. Not a clue. Somebody said something to me, I think before I left town, about George being gay. We didn't use that term. Mm-hmm. That's later. Mm-hmm. Homosexual. And Jimmy Fisher, I think, knew. He wasn't talking much about it. even to his friend, me. But he knew that Harvey was gay because he lived in Harvey's apartment. He rented Harvey's apartment, Rue Pont-aux-Choux, in Paris, 1 year when he was doing some research. So he knew about Harvey. But he respected George's privacy until George ready to come out. Of course, I know from Harry Osterhaus when that happened. And the thing that's extraordinary is that a closeted gay man who was afraid of being found out would not, as George actually did, have talked all the time about otherness, persecution, and of gay people and of effeminacy. But he was not afraid to do that. And what everybody thought of him as a consequence, he didn't care about. He wasn't trying to hide anything. And he didn't have, what do you call it when you have a girlfriend?
Oh, a beard.
Beard.
Beard, yeah.
He didn't have a beard. He never went in for that at all. And of course, unlike Harvey, who apparently went to this jazz club downtown Madison every night with a different young man, which I didn't know about until I saw the video. George was home reading books every night, which is why George published 15 books and Harvey published 1.
Yeah, there's definitely something to that.
Did it make a difference once we found out he was gay? No, but it explained a lot. And it put everything into proper focus and gave me, and of course he came out initially in the Netherlands. Gert Hekma and Harry Osterhaus and a bunch of other gay men, he felt comfortable there. And so he did it, and then that emboldened him, and he came back here and told his colleagues, and I guess the rest is history, as it were. But anyway, here's the other thing. I was so happy when I finally met John Tortorici. I'd known about him. I thought, he's the right guy for George.
Awesome, yeah. Great. Final thoughts? Any last?
I want to thank you for both of you for your commitment to this program, for your commitment to getting all this information and recording people who may be 6 feet under in about 3 or 4 years. And I think it's important to capture history while you can. This is the kind of history that, God, George only had these resources back in those days. Can you imagine what he'd been able to do with it?
Yeah.
And I think, I really think it's incredibly important. One of my old professors, Charlie Burdick, did military history, interviewed old Nazi officers, and he published his work. It was extremely important. It made a huge contribution to the history of the Second World War. So these things are important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
This has been a wonderful interview.
Thank you.
I appreciate you taking the time.